Well, you've no doubt heard the term winter of discontent being thrown around at the moment, but are things really as bad as the late 1970s? And just how much worse could it get in coming months? Britain's biggest unions, Unite, Unison, the GMB, RMT, PCS, CWU, are taking hundreds of thousands of workers out on strike across public services, the transport network and the wider economy. It'll cause huge disruption and further damage an economy struggling with soaring inflation. Let's now talk to the head of public services at the organisation that represents all trade unions, the TUC. That's Kevin Rowan, and he joins me now. Mr. Rowan, very good to talk to you today. Thanks for joining us from up north. There are people who will not be able to travel after horrendous periods being apart since COVID over the Christmas period. That, along with many other disruptions to people's lives over the next few days. Are the unions holding the country to ransom?
Well, I think the unions are trying to get a fair deal for their members, and and you mentioned right across the economy, working people are suffering the cost of living crisis. Many of them haven't had a pay rise for several years in the public services. Most workers have had below inflation pay rises every year under this government, and you also heard that the reason why these strikes are not getting resolved and people are able to call those strikes off is because the government are effectively blocking the strikes being cancelled. So I think there is certainly a huge challenge here. There is certainly a massive impact on the economy, but the only way that we're going to resolve these issues is if people do get round the table and find a solution and don't block, and that the government doesn't block solutions when they are on the table.
The ambulance drivers' strikes is one that is causing a lot of fear for a lot of people. Just talking to the unions for the doctors, who said that she believed people probably would die over the coming weeks because of what is happening. Are you worried that there's going to be a shift in public attitudes to what is happening if people start losing their loved ones because of this?
Well, I think people are really, really worried about what's happening in the health service already before the strikes. We're seeing ambulances waiting 6, 8 hours before they can drop their patients off or get the patients into accident emergency. We're seeing people waiting longer than they have to in A&E and in other parts of the health service. What we're seeing is public services across the board that are falling apart at the seams. So I think the public are genuinely worried about that level of public service. And it's a real, I think, mark of shame on this government that those dedicated professionals that we all rely on and we all clapped through the pandemic feel so desperate that they have to take industrial action just to get the government to hear their experiences, both personal in terms of their wages, but also the services that they provide. That's what people are going on strike for, in order to protect services and ultimately give a decent service to those members of the public. And I think they get that. I think that they see where the fault lines here. They support the workforce, and they really want the government to get around the table and find a solution. At the moment, the government doesn't seem prepared to do that.
Yeah. Do you accept, though, that what you're asking for is unrealistic? 5% on top of inflation is a huge sum. The IFS thinks it would probably cost every household in the country about £640. Given the cost of living crisis, this just isn't a bill that the country as a whole can afford.
Well, I think you're right to focus on affordability, Jane. I mean, the fact is, the government are making political choices around taxation. If they were to tax profit, capital gains tax, and share dividends at the same rate that they're taxing wages, they would be able to afford to give every public service worker a fair pay rise. But they're choosing instead to effectively stuff the pockets of the wealthy who get their income from profits and shares, and and squeeze the purses of the workers who are generating those profits. So these are political choices. The government could make different choices that would allow them to pay public sector workers properly, but they're choosing not to do so.
In all fairness, the government, though, they did increase taxes on some of those higher salaries in the recent budget. The IFS also, as you know, independent and well-respected body, they say that when they look at remuneration, because the argument that we hear from unions like yourselves is that the public sector pay isn't keeping pace with private sector pay. Well, the IFS says when you look at the gap in total remuneration, accounting for differences in both pay in the private sector, as well as differences in employee characteristics, so things like pensions, etc. The public to private differential is about 6%. In other words, total remuneration for public sector workers, according to the IFS, is on average 6% higher than for those who are privately employed. So, they would say that, and the government would say that you're not taking into account the other elements of working for the public service that are benefits, and that perhaps that is a little bit disingenuous, when you're trying to put your case towards the public.
Well, the reality is that workers in local government, workers in health, and workers in the civil service at the lower end of those pay rates are bumping along just above the national minimum wage, just above in pennies. We're not talking about pounds or pennies above the national minimum wage. So there is an absolute argument for improving pay in the public sector.
But there are lots in the private sector who are also on those salaries, aren't there?
Yeah, absolutely. And we think all workers should have a fair pay rise, whether they work in the private sector or in the public sector. And public sector workers have seen their pensions attacked year on year. So people are paying more now in their pension schemes and enjoying a poorer pension when they retire. The fact is, every year, every single year under this Conservative government, public sector workers have been made worse off. And private sector workers haven't been made much better off either under this government. They're trashing the economy. Their taxing system favours the rich and not the working class. These are choices that the government are making, and public sector workers deserve a fair pay rise.
Okay, Kevin Rowan, Head of Public Services at the TUC, thank you very much.